my assignment is to review the comprehensive plan and the LDC to understand the potential effect of the current policies and regulations on economic development, and to recommend adjustments that may be necessary to maintain the city's economic vitality. What I am not doing as part of this assignment is a complete evaluation, an appraisal, or an amendment of the comprehensive plan or of the LDC. I'm not writing language to amend either one. The city is due to make a decision as to whether they want to do a complete evaluation and appraisal review for the state in 2016. And so we're looking at this as more of an interim step with a strategic focus to resolve some issues that have been in people's minds over the last few years. This is not a market analysis, this is not an economic development study, and it's also not an urban design study. And it's not looking at specific properties. So I want to clarify that before we get started. So the process itself had 7 basic steps. We started back in March, I think, actually, and we had a kickoff at that point. I came here, I took a tour of the city with staff. I met with a lot of people over 2 days, and then after I came again, and I met with more people, and I talked to a few more on the phone. So those that I call stakeholder interviews became the basis for me to be able to understand what people really was, they were caring most about, what they felt was important. And parallel to that, I conducted the review of the comprehensive plan and the land development code to produce the report that you have in front of you today. We'll talk about what remains of this process at the end, but let me just get into just a few observations about the documents. The 3 that I reviewed primarily were the comprehensive plan, obviously, the land development code, and also, because of the focus of this exercise, the economic development plan. Those were not the only documents that I reviewed. I went through everything that individuals provided for me, information that I found online, information that the city provided, including the citizen surveys that were conducted a few years ago, all the planning and urban design studies that have been conducted over the past few years, the 1991 plan, all kinds of other documents. But as far as the 2009 plan, which is the focus of this exercise, it was found in compliance by what is now former DCA in May of the year after having been submitted as adopted in February of the same year. And it supersedes the comprehensive plan from 1991. It was a previous update that was not found in compliance and basically was discarded and started from scratch as the version that is in use today. The Land Development Code is Chapter 58. You'll know that. It was adopted wholesale in 1998. It has not been updated wholesale, however. It has been updated and amended in piecemeal form. And rezoning seem to be the most routine type of amendment that occurs. Just this year alone, between, I think, January and June, there were about 14 rezonings that amended. So the other document that I reviewed, like I mentioned, is the Economic Development Plan, which is a short-term plan. It's more of a strategic plan. It's a 3-year term. It was completed in 2011, and the city has been implementing it. I presume that soon you will have your second report, it identified a series of issues that the city wanted to focus on, as well as 7 business clusters that are listed on the screen, and include education and knowledge creation, real estate and development, arts and culture, healthcare services, financial and professional services, creative services, and retail services. This is consistent with service economy that Winter Park is primarily based on. One of the things that the Economic Development Plan does is talk about tax-based composition, and this is something that came up in my conversations with a lot of the stakeholders that I talked to, because your tax base is primarily geared towards residential tax revenue, approximately 79% versus 19% for commercial and 2% for the other category. So it's very heavily reliant on residential taxes. And although this is not very uncommon, it is a concern for the city, because the city is fairly landlocked, and it does have some areas that do need help in revitalizing. There are opportunities. So we need to be strategic in looking at those. Just to kind of recap the Economic Development Plan, it does set a mission for economic development for the city, and it does set a goal and strategic objectives and actions. And there's 5 of those objectives and a series of actions that, as I mentioned, the city is in the process of implementing. We'll talk about which ones have been taking place already. But the interesting thing is that these goals and objectives have not been integrated into the comprehensive plan. That is not to say that there are no goals and policies in the comp plan that refer to economic development, but it's a little bit more diffuse. And the comp plan is supposed to be a long-term document, whereas this is a fairly short-term kind of action plan. So for the implementation, funding of a little bit less than $300,000 has been set aside, and the city has been really good about tracking, monitoring, and reporting, as I mentioned, on the progress. And the year 1 accomplishments include having brought ULI to look at the West Fairbanks Avenue corridor and producing what is called a technical assistance panel report, which I thought had some pretty good recommendations. Let's see, state office building land swap, workforce, affordable housing analysis, commercial real estate listing inventory, and creating an economic development website. So those are things that have been done already. And the city is already working on implementing objectives from their year 2 plan. And one of my major observations about the plan is that, on one hand, it doesn't have an overall vision for the city with all these different parts that is cohesive, and it also doesn't have a vision for many of these different sub-areas that fits in with that larger vision. Park Avenue is the heart of the city. A lot of people identify the identity of the Winter Park with Park Avenue. There are other corridors that are very significant, very important as well. But not everything in Winter Park looks like that. These were my first impressions when I drove into Winter Park a few months ago. I don't think I had been here for many, many, many years. And I was thinking, when do I get there? And then I realized that this was Winter Park. And to me, it was surprising to realize, frankly, and I guess I did have somewhat of a preconceived notion, I confess. But it was a surprise that Winter Park was actually so diverse in character, in districts, in people, in everything. And it was a pleasant surprise. So when I went through a comprehensive plan, I could understand that there could be conflict about it, because I think that the feelings are very strong for the parts of the city that are considered sort of the historic core, and not so much, or perhaps just as strong, but on the opposite side, for those areas that are newer, that perhaps don't fit into that image that a lot of people tend to have. So that's kind of the context I wanted to give you. As I went through the comprehensive plan and the land development code, I identified a series of issues, and many of those were confirmed by my conversations with the stakeholders, and I kind of categorized them into three major headings. I'm not going to talk about the other issues tonight because they're kind of peripheral to my task. They're not really something that I can deal with in my scope. And perhaps the core issues are not as well, but I think that they're so important because we can fix some things in this plan, but if we don't fix these things, we'll continue to find ourselves in conflict over the years. And that's why I felt that it was necessary to talk about those. So I have some core issues and problems, and then I have some specific and regulatory issues that I want to talk about. Again, it was not a comprehensive review of the entire comprehensive plan, but just a look at some strategic sections, topics, issues that can be fixed now, and over the next couple of years, the city can decide whether they're going to pursue preparing an amendment for the state to become consistent with the amended statutes, which I think that the city will want to do, frankly. Okay, so the first issue that became very, very evident was that there's disagreement in the understanding about the role and purpose of the comprehensive plan. There are complete perspectives of what a comprehensive plan is or should be. Is it a high-level policy guide, or is it a locus for very detailed rules and directives that are there to give basically the land development code teeth? People feel very strongly on both sides of that subject. But undoubtedly there's language in the plan that sets it apart from many others because it's very detailed, it's very regulation oriented, and in fact there are some policies where it appears as if the language has been taken directly from a development code, and I quote just one section in my report that you may remember. So that became pretty apparent to me. And my reaction to that was, if the regulations are well written, and I think that in the majority of cases these are, then there's no need to duplicate them in the comprehensive plan, because the plan. Yeah.
There have been elections lost and won in this city.
I understand that.
Comprehensive plan.
Absolutely. I am aware of that.
Directly involved in those elections.
I am aware of that.
And I think if we're going to move forward, we need to be realistic about what we can and can't do together and agree. Because there's so many things that are said you can't do in that plan. It's not a plan that encourages the things that we'd like to happen. It discourages things that people don't want to happen in this town. And I think, I just don't want to spend a lot of time going through that, because it's something that is unrealistic to pretend that we're going to change the comp plan and put all that stuff in the land development code.
But
It's what we need to do, but realistically, it's going to be a tough situation.
it's what you need to do, but not just because of the reasons that you mentioned. It's what you need to do because there's also language in the statutes that say that this is so.
Well, then that's fine. Then somebody needs to bring that up.
Yes, and I did. I already mentioned that, to me, the absence of a shared consensus on community vision is a big deal, because I think that one of the reasons that the plan tends to overregulate is because it doesn't come from consensus on that vision. Because it becomes an instrument for preventing attacks on something which is defined to some extent in the plan, but not well enough to cover every part of the community. And so that kind of leads me to the next issue, which is the one size fits all mentality. And I think the vision statement is really important because it sets the tone for the whole plan. This is something that the city may want to consider doing prior to embarking on an amendment of the plan for the next cycle at the state level, if you decide to do it, and even if you don't. And the vision statement doesn't even have to be integrated into the plan. I worked in a lot of communities that have gone through that exercise. It's a very healing exercise, I found, and they can adopt the vision statement separately from the plan, or they can, put it in the plan as sort of the beacon, the destination that the whole plan becomes, an aspiration to. The other issue that I notice is that a lot of people seem to think that growth and preservation are incompatible. And obviously that's not true. The city, as those images that I showed you demonstrate, has changed a lot, and it has been able to keep its essence. And so the question is how to find that balance and how to put it into regulations that can help us maintain that essence. Because it's really important. One of the things that surprised me is that the comprehensive plan doesn't have a historic preservation element standalone. There are, some objectives, some goals that are woven into the land use element, but given the importance of this topic, I found myself somewhat surprised that it became its own element. And one of my suggestions would be to consider doing that. Now, the statutes no longer dictate which types of optional elements you can have, and so historic preservation certainly can be one of those, and there are no parameters. I already talked about the one-size-fits-all approach, the difference in these districts. There's a lot of language in the plan that tends to negate those differences. It talks about this village character as if the entire city could be like that. And we know that is unrealistic. You have some corridors that just by their very functional and structural nature cannot be turned into Park Avenue. And probably you wouldn't want them to be, because otherwise you start diluting this core that is, the very essence of what we think of as Winter Park. But each one of them has to have its own special character. The other thing that struck me is that, and I mentioned this a little bit already, there's no integration between the economic development plan's goals and the comprehensive plan. And I thought that perhaps there would be an economic development element in the plan, and there isn't. And again, there are goals and objectives that are woven into the text of the future land use element, but perhaps for clarity and also perhaps as part of that vision, we need to better define what those goals are and highlight them so that we can work towards them, not on a 3-year term, but on a long term. And so one of my suggestions is that, again, for this next amendment cycle, the city considered the possibility of developing an economic development element for the plan. And related to some of these other issues, we need to clarify the purpose of the Land Development Code versus the comprehensive plan. There are a lot of things in there that isn't clear why they are in there in the first place, what they are supposed to accomplish. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of redundancy. I think that the code could be streamlined, and every time that we create a regulation, we need to ask ourselves, what are we trying to do with this, and why? So those are the really important questions that the city should be asking every time that a regulatory change comes through. And I think that one of the things that came up repeatedly in my conversations was that one of the reasons why perhaps development has not been always affected by regulations in this plan or in this code is because the staff here is really, really good. And that's a fantastic thing, but even staff is not static. And if for any reason, let's hope not, but you had someone here who isn't as good at kind of finding their way through it, there are plenty of things that could stop a project that the city actually might want. And so I think that that's something important to note. From the policy standpoint, concurrency is one of the bigger changes that came through in 2011 in the statutes. In Winter Park, the concurrency management regulations are incorporated into the land development code, but in 2012, effectively, the legislature deleted 3 types of facilities from the concurrency requirements: transportation, parks and recreation, and schools. And there, since then, a number of communities have already opted out of one or more of these requirements. So we do have some sense of how that's working out. A lot of them have found really strong advantages to opting out, and not many disadvantages. But it's not very simple. So for transportation here, the issue is, you have in particular some major arterial corridors that are owned and maintained by FDOT, and there's not a whole lot that can be done level of service wise. If you want to continue to redevelop those corridors, you're not going to be comfortable prohibiting development from happening until concurrency occurs. There are mitigating things that can be done, but it is a tremendous burden on the staff, on the developers, and we have not been able to determine how effective those measures really are. Now, with regards to parks and recreation, the nature of the issue is whether the current level of service standard is reasonable. It is set at 10 acres per 1,000. I did a study, and I looked actually at about 30 communities regionally and also in other parts of the state. This is one of the highest that I found. I think I only found one other that was higher. The majority were significantly lower, or they were just different in terms of looking at a standard for community parks versus neighborhood parks. That's something that Winter Park doesn't do. But it's an issue because Winter Park is mature, it's landlocked, and it is expecting additional growth over the next 15 years. There's going to be, according to projections, about 5,000, 6,000 more people here. And even though today the city has a surplus of parkland, by that time it will have a deficit of almost 50 acres. And where is that land going to come from? You're landlocked. So redevelopment is probably one of the ways in which you're going to be able to generate some additional land. But at what levels has to make you consider whether the 10 acres per 1,000 person is actually sustainable. With regards to parks and recreation, I also came up with some options. The first one is to adjust, as the simplest one, but perhaps not the most amenable to some people. But it would be to adjust the adopted level of service to something lower, and even going down to just 8 acres per 1,000, you could continue to meet your level of service standard up to the year 2028, which is the horizon of the plan. So that's one possibility. The other one is to, which in my opinion is not the most recommended, but to review the city's long-term annexation strategy, because a lot of the growth that the city is going to experience is through annexation. And so that would be one way to do it. And the third one, which is actually somewhat supplementary or complementary to the first one, would be to develop a non-residential system development charge, is what it's called, SDC. And that would allow the city to require non-residential development to pay a fee or to dedicate parkland as part of their development approval. We do that today with residential development, but this would be a means to address the non-residential development, which is going to be the primary focus on some of those districts and corridors that we've talked about. This was a really hot issue, definition of floor area ratio. There's a policy in the future land use element that is actually written as a definition, but this definition is not in the definition section of the plan. And it's very specific and very narrow, and it even includes the methodology for calculating floor area ratio, which is somewhat unusual. Usually you'll see that in the land development regulations. The other thing that came up a lot is the fact that here the definition of floor area ratio includes structure parking.
They ain't gonna change. That is a hot button.
It is a hot button issue, I realize that.
It should change, but again, it's one of those.
But if bottom line, the issue is concerned with the bulk or the appearance of structured parking facilities in certain areas, in my opinion, those can be addressed and resolved through other types of standards. And so we need to look at some options, and I'm going to do that in a second. Of course, the simplest one would be to, well, this is related to the comprehensive plan, but it would be to start by removing the detail in that definition that is contained in the comp plan. Take it out of the policy, but keep it in the land development code. Eliminate private parking garages from the calculation, either across the board, that is applicable to every parcel in the city, or maintain private parking garages in the calculation of FAR only in key quarters of the CBD, such as Park Avenue, North Avenue, Hannibal Square, etc., but exempt those parking garages in other areas of the city. I think this is important because a quarter like West Fairbanks Avenue, you're going to run into issues. If that area redevelops, you have parcels that are not of a size to always provide the type of, or the amount of on-site parking that that could be required. And so you're going to have to look at not just this, but also some complementary measures, shared parking, access management, structured parking perhaps that could be shared, etc. The other option is to keep the private parking garages in the FAR, but increase the allowance to at least 300. And I feel very strongly that the city does need to implement a comprehensive mobility strategy. I know that there was a parking study that was recently completed for the CBD, and the city's moving forward in implementing some of the recommendations, but it has to be more than just parking. The city's going to have to start thinking in terms of providing some options for accessing some of these districts, not just CBD, not just Park Avenue, but other areas of the city. And that could include transit and walking and biking, etc. Density and floor area ratio. We already talked about floor area ratio, but one of the interesting things here is that in this comprehensive plan and land development code, they are very strongly connected. It's either or, that's kind of the situation. And typically what we have is actually not either or, but one and the other. And you get a combination of things particularly in areas where you want to encourage the type of development that would have both non-residential and residential. So I think that the city needs to look at that, at least for those areas. There's also some confusion as to how to calculate, I think there's actually a lot of confusion as to how to calculate floor area ratio and density when they're applied on the same property. So we need to look at those. It's actually fairly simple because a lot of places do it. I mean, this is not, you know, inventing something new, but it is not clear in this particular plan. And understand that the motivation for having this primarily was to discourage McMansions, essentially, or other excessively large building volumes. But rather than doing it with density and floor area ratio, you could do it with, and in fact, the code does have all these things as well, a combination of building height, setbacks, building coverage, and also design guidelines for breaking up the mass and the facade of a structure. So it just seems like it's a little bit of overkill. And that was kind of my sense as I went through the code in the plan, because it was just everything that anyone could possibly think of, just in case. And it is not always necessary if these things are written appropriately. Building height was another hot button issue. The comprehensive plan defines it in terms of number of stories, and the land development code defines it in terms of linear feet per floor. And I also felt that that difference was probably unnecessary. If the main concern is building height or the volume or the scale or even the outer appearance, then you could just use height in total feet combined with standards or guidelines for articulating the facade, creating appropriate floor lines, and other design guidelines to ensure that the outer appearance of those volumes is compatible with the surrounding area. I found some inconsistencies in the language of the planned unit residential development section. That designation is only mentioned in the text description of the single-family residential designation, but not on the low-density residential designation, even though the plan says that both of those districts accommodate it. The land development code includes provisions for multifamily dwellings, but the comprehensive plan does not. And so that's another inconsistency. And I think also the maximum building heights for multifamily may be unachievable when they're combined with the floor area ratio that's prescribed. The planned development districts, that was an important section for me to look at, because this is really the only true mixed-use district that the city has in its zoning. But I felt that it might be unnecessary to have two of them, because even though there's some differences in densities and intensities, everything else was pretty much the same. And so you could have accomplished the same thing with one district that provided a range of those. And I also felt that this district designation did not really provide as much flexibility as you would expect to see. That's the purpose of this designation. And this is a designation that the city actually adopted fairly recently, and I guess somewhat in response to the recession, to try to provide an incentive for developers, but it hasn't really been tested yet. And I think part of the reason is because of the way that it is structured in this plan and in this code. For one thing, like I said, there's not as much flexibility, and there are two things that are fairly onerous. The first one is that the maximum size threshold are pretty low. And also, because of that, if you put a property that is larger than that threshold through the process, you're gonna end up having to go to 2, perhaps even 3 different types of processes. And so that becomes too much of a burden to make it attractive. The other thing that struck me was that there is a parking lot future land use designation. I don't think I had ever seen that. Because parking lots are not typically considered a principal use. And as such, they really should not be treated separately. If you designate in your comprehensive plan a surface parking lot with its own district, you're basically protecting it. And I think I understand why that was done, but typically your surface parking lots are your opportunities for future development at some point in the history of the city. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, and now these are sort of, memorialized with their own district. And so I thought that was unusual, but I think that that the city needs to actually look at that again. So those were the areas that I focused on. The next steps for us is to get feedback from both of your boards, from the public, to revise this document, to incorporate the comments, to respond to those comments, and come up with a final summary of recommendations. And then we'll go to the city council commission, make a public presentation, and create the final report. So with that, I'm going to close and open it up for discussion.